In ancient days, men looked at stars and saw their heroes in the constellations. In modern times, we do much the same, but our heroes are epic men of flesh and blood. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind.
Welcome back. Today we're tackling the deep and perplexing lore of the Nixonverse, which is essentially season 3 of the Monument Mythos series, and of course I do suggest that you guys watch all of seasons 1 and 2 before watching this video, as the Nixonverse picks up right at the end of season 2 of MM. I'll link all of the playlists below in the description, as well as Mr. Manticore's YouTube channel. I did spend a lot of time researching and just trying to piece everything together, especially the last video, so I really do hope you enjoy this. Without further ado, let's begin the amazing tale of the Nixonverse.
He was not born the height of a man. He was born much taller. Even as a child, he could stand over. However, he chooses to be the height of a man. Why? Because he thinks himself as a man. And one man changes size often. Sometimes to protect us. Sometimes to hurt. Sometimes to scare and humiliate us. I believe one day that man will become a giant. Conquer us all.
More powerful than a locomotive, impervious to bullets. Up in the
In the very first video of this series, we are introduced to a being called the Last Son of Alcatraz. The video goes on to highlight the power of the Last Son, saying that he is able to change his size in the midst of battle, and often intervenes in wars to protect not only US soldiers, but also foreign soldiers if he deems necessary. The narrator believes that one day this man will become a giant to conquer us all. So what we know as of right now is that this being is capable of shape-shifting, flight, and has super strength, essentially acting as this universe's Superman. This first video is intentionally left very mysterious in terms of wider lore, and all we are given really is a generic overview of the Last Son, as well as some instances of foreshadowing. Very soon we will learn that having such immense power isn't all that it's cracked up to be.
June 6, 1944. American units landed on Omaha Beach, unaware of the massacre that was about to occur. As those men waded into the water, they could not have known that their chances of survival that day were 1 in 4. Those men were outnumbered by hundreds of thousands of bullets. According to determinism, these men had no free will. The 10 million men who were drafted for World War II had no free will, and the men that day who landed in the water had nowhere to go but forward. The atoms of these men led them all to a moment of almost certain death. That all changed with the Knight. We know little about him, but what we do know is that he is not of this world. While everyone's atoms are following a defined course in our universe, the Knight's atoms are not. His world is gone, and when you have no world left, then what course is there to follow? The Knight is the only one in our existence with true free will. Only he has the ability to change lives. Determinism states that the American men sailing toward Omaha Beach were meant to die that day. The Knight arrived in shining armor and rerouted those lives. The Knight deflected bullets, destroyed anti-aircraft guns, and lifted men out of harm's way. Before you could have shouted, "It's a bird! It's a plane!" the Knight had saved hundreds of lives whose fates were previously set. The Knight could have acted selfishly, watched as we lived out our lives, but he chose not to. The one man with free will chose to save those who were not meant to survive. With the Knight, Death is no longer a deterministic guarantee. At any time, at any place, the Knights can save us.
In the second video, we are presented with footage of D-Day, aka Operation Overlord. Now, a brief history lesson in case you don't recall. D-Day marked the event on June 6, 1944, where the Allied forces launched an amphibious invasion on Normandy. This invasion would take over 2 months to complete, and at the time, it was estimated that only 1 out of 4 people would survive. We are greeted with a close-up of the D-Day knight losing his helmet, as well as some text telling us that the Horned Serpent lives. Now, this is where I would like to refer back to the main Monument Mythos series, and for the rest of the video, I'm going to refer to the Monument Mythos as MM for short. The Horned Serpent is the main antagonist in MM and was believed to be residing under the United States. But at the end of MM, we find out that this was actually inaccurate, as it actually spans all across the Earth. Furthermore, we know that this serpent is actually George Washington after he chopped another entity in the MM universe called a special tree. Now, this tree acts as a sort of interdimensional rabbit hole, and after cutting the tree, Washington then fell into Wonderland, thus having his body transformed and disfigured into the Horned Serpent when he tried to climb out. Later on, George Washington as the Serpent was fed through the Statue of Liberty in the 1870s. The special tree would then later spit out multiple George Washingtons back into the world so that history would play out more or less the same. Now back to the D-Day Knight. The narrator tells us that the Knight is not of this world, and he seemingly has changed the course of many US soldiers' lives in World War II, specifically during the D-Day invasion. Furthermore, while everyone that resides in this world is on a defined course in our universe, the Knight is the only one with true free will. Again, the big takeaway in this video is just the sheer power and capability of the Knight. The narrator said that on the day of the invasion, the soldiers were essentially destined to die with no free will of their own. But the D-Day Knight being so powerful was the only person that could change the course of fate that day. I want you guys to quickly ask yourselves, what do you think would be the response of the general population if someone such as the D-Day Knight were to join society? Would they be greeted with love as many heroes are in traditional media, or will they be feared? For now, just remember your answer until the very end of this video. The D-Day Knight video ends with a close-up of the initially shown image of the Knight's helmet. In this video, there are some very heavy implications that this helmet is the actual skeleton of the Horned Serpent, and the actual skull is that of George Washington. How the D-Day Knight got this helmet, we're not quite sure. Is the Knight somehow a reincarnation of the Serpent? Again, we don't really know. And just a quick fun fact, remember how earlier I said that George Washington was disfigured when he was in Wonderland? Some people actually think that the horns are a result of Washington's hat also being morphed along with his body. I don't know if that's actually canon or anything, but I just thought it was a very cool detail.
There's a great division coming about on this planet. There are going to be a lot of people who will die because they just don't know how to live. They don't know what life's about. They don't know how to give, how to love. Nobody wants to. And those who are beautiful enough, I don't mean physically, but something beyond that, they will have the chance to learn how to fly, to be beautiful, to rise above the level of the normal human, to be superior beings first, and eventually gods and goddesses.
My God, it's heaven. There's air here.
Ed, what the hell are you waiting for, man? Blast her!
The third video in the playlist is titled The Queen of the Lunarians, which introduces yet another character to us. On an expedition to the moon, Ed Dwight, John Glenn, and Michael Collins would come across the Queen of the Lunarians. Immediately, Ed says the following: "She's here, she will speak first." The Queen tells us there is a great division coming and many people will be lost because they do not know how to live. If you remember, the Great Division was the event that concluded the MM series. This event unleashed the Horned Serpent, and the Horned Serpent then sent out a wave of special trees into the universe, and that turned the world into the Corner World. And for the sake of the video, I won't explain what that is, since it's not very important for the lore of the Nixonverse, but you can sort of think of it as a pocket dimension of sorts. So it seems that now in this other timeline / universe, the Queen wants to repeat the Great Division. Additionally, there will be some people who will ascend to become superior beings, and eventually gods and goddesses. After the Queen finishes her speech, Michael discovers that there is air on the moon, and John then commands Ed to use his ray gun on the Queen. Ed and Mike are petrified to find that the Queen has seemingly ended John right in front of their eyes. We soon learn that John's cause of death has been labeled as an eviction from reality. The Queen has some sort of supernatural power associated with what seems to be a wand of sorts. The death certificate goes on to state that John's death took approximately 1 minute to finish. Very quickly, I want to recap what we just learned before we move on, as these are the 3 main characters for now that we'll be focusing on as we move forward. The first 3 videos were more like prologues than anything else, giving a bit of backstory before throwing us into the Nixonverse. First, we have the last son of Alcatraz, who is akin to Superman in this universe. He has super strength, is capable of shapeshifting, and has the ability to fly. We also know that he has played a role in various wars involving the US. Secondly, we have the D-Day Knight, who played a massive role in World War II. For the most part, the D-Day Knight has powers similar to the Last Son, and he is in some way tied to the Horned Serpent from the main MM series. He can fly, possesses super strength, etc. Finally, we have the Queen of the Lunarians, who resides on the moon. We know that she is obsessed with an upcoming event called the Great Division, and she also has the ability to manipulate light and energy with her wand, which is capable of evicting people from reality.
And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man.
This is where we truly begin the wild ride of the Nixonverse. Jesus in Vietnam starts as a sort of propaganda message involving the war in Vietnam. We are shown a message saying "Sweep and Redeem Trial 1" with a cross in the middle. This is basically signifying the US imposing their own values onto other nations. I'm not religious, so I won't dive too deep into this, but in Christianity, redemption is an idea that is heavily pushed and refers to the deliverance of Christians from sin. So this message here saying to sweep and redeem means sweeping across Vietnam to quote-unquote redeem its inhabitants and purging whoever stands against them. Vietnam being trial 1, I would assume more nations will also be swept in time. We abruptly cut to an image of someone crucifying themselves on a cross to imitate Jesus Christ. On screen, we can also see the text, "It was the only way." To me, this phrase sounds like a way for someone to cope with the deeds done in this war that they can't emotionally handle. I want to quickly sidetrack for now and provide some supplemental info on the timeline. World War II took place from 1939 to 45, and we know that the D-Day Knight participated in that war. In the Last Son of Alcatraz video, we saw the Last Son participating in the Korean War, which took place from 1950 to 53. And finally, we are in the Vietnam War, which happened between 1955 and 1975. So it wouldn't be a stretch to assume that either the D-Day Knight or the Last Son also took part in the Vietnam War. However, I believe this man on the cross is the Last Son, and the text "It was the only way" was him showing his discontent for this war. To support this, in the first video there were some lines of dialogue that highlighted how the Last Son chose to be more man than anything else, when in reality he is not simply just a man. In some instances, Jesus is looked at as being larger than life by the public, when in reality he holds himself as an equal to the rest of mankind. Furthermore, the audio saying that Jesus increased in wisdom and stature could just be figurative, but to me it's highlighting the Last Son's ability to increase his size at will. With strange music playing in the background, we are told that the value of both America and Bethlehem are greater than millions of lives. Bethlehem being the renamed Vietnam that has been overtaken by the US. Again, I want to add some extra real world info in here that I thought was pretty cool. There is a place called Bethlehem, and again, I know very little about religion, but this is supposedly the location where Jesus was born. And in that previous slide, we saw Jesus in the Vietnam War, seemingly marking the birth or at least the realization that Jesus exists physically in this world. And Vietnam was the first location where he was shown to the world. Continuing on, we have some more propaganda-like messaging showing us that America has the plan to take over the world, even if it means sacrificing millions of lives. We also learn about the peace equation, which says our freedom is greater than your freedom. Our Christ is greater than your Christ. And if we have both freedom and our Christ, we will have world peace, further pushing the imperialism narrative for America.
Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen.
The final portion of this video opens up on the moon with a quote, "Their peace is built on inequality." In the background, we can hear a Bible verse and we realize we are praying to a mysterious glowing being and that this is actually God. I did some research on the actual Bible verse, and if anyone who actually studies the Bible is watching with more knowledge on this, feel free to correct me in the comments. But the point of this verse is to highlight the role of God, that role being as a provider. This is highlighted through the line, "Give us this day our daily bread." Bread obviously being the basic necessity of food that allows us to live. And deliver us from evil, to show God acting as our guide. This clip dumps a lot on us and creates some room to theorize. I want to bring up the figure of Jesus in Vietnam one more time. When I was researching certain parts of the Bible to get a better understanding of this Nixonverse story, I came across two interpretations of Jesus. Again, anyone more knowledgeable than me on this, feel free to correct me. Some people interpret Jesus as being the Son of God, while others view Jesus and God as the same being. Now, it isn't important which you believe for this video, but I brought this up because with this information, we can theorize that the last son is connected to this God character on the moon. To some of you, this image might look very familiar. That's because it's actually this image right here of Richard Nixon. And while it was likely fairly obvious that Nixon was God with the teaser trailer and whatnot, at this point in the story, we have officially confirmed that Nixon is indeed God. The video ends on a compilation of clips of The Last Son, and I don't know about you guys, but to me, this looks like a younger version of Nixon. So whether you think this is Nixon, a son of Nixon, a Nixon clone, whatever, all that matters is that you understand that he is associated with God. In The Missing Eye of Jesus Christ, we are taken back in time to around 1953 when the Korean War ended. We find out that the last son resides in a fortress built by himself in Alaska, and upon returning home, the US sent nuclear missiles after him. This event would result in the capture of the last son, as well as the destruction of Alaska, displaying the lengths America is willing to go in order to fulfill their peace equation. Additionally, during this incident, the last son lost one of his eyes, and if we go back to the last video, Jesus in Vietnam, we can see that he indeed doesn't have an eye, but due to the black and white nature of the video and images, it was nearly impossible to spot without being informed of its presence, or rather lack thereof.
Apollo 12 to Houston, can you read? Apollo 12, this is Houston. Go ahead. We shot the lunarian and recovered their eye. Copy that, Apollo 12. Have a safe takeoff. Over.
After the Apollo 11 mission, Ed and Michael returned to Earth and informed their government of the power of the lunarians. In order to obtain this magical power, the US government launched the Apollo 12 mission focused on returning to the moon to retrieve lunarian samples. Upon landing, the crew successfully acquires an eye from a lunarian by force. And a quick note, this is not the eye of the Queen, it's just from a random lunarian on the moon. If you take a look at the eye, you might recognize it from somewhere. It's actually the tip of the wand used by the Queen in one of the earlier videos where John was evicted from reality. So we now know that the lunarians carry magical properties within their eyes, and the US has gotten their hands on one. Once the crew returns to Earth, the US implants the eye into the last son after capturing him in Alaska. This set of events would enrage the Queen, who sees this as a declaration of war. Upon successfully implanting the eye, the last son begins a transformation. This transformation would result in him becoming an impersonator of the Lord, but along with the transformation, the US government has undergone extensive efforts to brainwash the last son as well into believing that he is actually Jesus. This new information now clears up a large portion of the Jesus in Vietnam video. The last son we saw in the Vietnam War was not the same person mentally as the one in the first video participating in the Korean War. This new last son is a brainwashed superhuman who believes he is Jesus Christ, and in order to bring world peace, he is going to sweep and redeem all of the world on behalf of the US government. We end the video with two new quotes, the first of which says, "If thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. Now, what does this mean exactly? Well, like with many Bible verses, there are multiple interpretations. The interpretation that I believe Alex was going for is the one about the evil eye, aka the ungenerous eye. This interpretation highlights Jesus warning his followers not to deviate from their focus on God and to not concern themselves with worldly things, meaning put your all into God and make him your sole focus. The next quote is a derivative of sorts inspired by Gandhi. An eye for an eye makes the whole world mine. The original quote from Gandhi being an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind is saying that if we continue to fight back against those we deem as evil, then we're no better ourselves. So this new version is encouraging violence. If we choose to fight back against those we hate, then we have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Up till now, we've been going over the videos in the order they're presented in on Mr. Manticore's Nixonverse playlist, but for now I'm gonna deviate from that order just a little bit. Instead of covering the House in the Ocean video, we're going to cover the Sea of the Last Sun first. House in the Ocean is by far the longest video, spanning across 40 minutes, and I want to give it its own dedicated video, otherwise this video will be much longer than I originally wanted it to be. If we can hit 1k likes on this video, I'll put in some overtime and get the House in the Ocean video out within the week. The House in the Ocean video isn't exactly mandatory to understand the Nixonverse story, plus it was actually uploaded way before the Nixonverse, before being deleted and then re-uploaded, but it does add quite a bit of interesting info and details to The Last Sun. So if you want to see that video as soon as possible, definitely hit the like button. We begin with a statement saying that the last son has become a carpenter, just like Jesus, and I'll elaborate on this in just a moment. We see the brainwashed Jesus Christ, aka the last son, floating across the coast of Alaska, which has now been officially renamed as Dark Alaska after being brutally nuked by the US government, turning it into a wasteland. This false Jesus Christ then uses his ability to shapeshift, this time turning himself into a house. Let's now return to the opening statement about the carpenter. In scripture, Jesus is oftentimes referred to as being a carpenter, and his earthly father Joseph was also a carpenter and is likely the one to teach him these skills. So once again, just a beautiful implementation of real world religion into this fictional world created by Alex.
No!
In a shocking turn of events, the Lunarians decide to visit the Last Sun with a proposal. Okay, so there is a lot to unpack here. First, I want to bring up this statement from the Last Sun. So very obviously there is a lot of outside influence from DC in this universe, and as you may remember, the Last Sun used to live in a fortress built by himself in Alaska. After coming to his senses and realizing his wrongdoings, the Last Sun has decided to take the form of his childhood home to seek comfort, which is likely inspired by the comic book events where Superman's Fortress of Solitude was destroyed, turning it back into the Crystal of Knowledge, which contains immense info on the Kryptonians, both positive and negative. The crystal would later be returned to Superman, who would use it to recreate his fortress. Both this house and the crystal are symbols of a previously more positive time in each of the heroes' lives. In this sequence of events, we can see that the Lunarians are beginning their plot to invade Earth by swaying the Last Sun into becoming their lord. When the Last Sun brings up his feelings of guilt for what he did in Vietnam, the Lunarians would reply, "It was not you, you were not yourself." If you remember, there was a quote saying it was the only way in the Jesus in Vietnam video. It seems now we have come full circle in the Last Sun's emotions from denial during Vietnam to now acceptance. The Last Sun then says, "I was and always will have been a vessel for hate and destruction." The Last Sun believes that no matter how much self-control he has, there will always be others in the world or the universe looking for an opportunity to exploit him for personal gain. We then see the Lunarians explicitly asking the Last Sun to be their king, which the Last Sun turns down. The Lunarians do not handle this well and then forcibly capture the Last Sun in order to force upon him another transformation, this time into the Crescent King. We end the video with an evolution chart of the Last Sun where we can observe the stages the Last Sun has gone through. An innocent pedestrian that has captured the power of a god, to a corrupt fallen hero, and then finally an evolution into a giant to conquer us all. The D-Day night returns begins with a jumbled mess of text, and we learn that the reason why this message is so messed up is because of the Crescent King. After being forcibly turned into the king of the Lunarians, the Last Sun must have awakened additional powers with his Lunarian eye. We already know that the eye can eradicate people from reality, but it seems it's also capable of erasing more abstract ideas or concepts such as language. For now, only the English language has been quote-unquote destroyed, and I would assume if left unchecked, this would spread across the world, destroying all traditional human speech. We learned that this process was slow and well hidden, to the point where nobody was even aware that they were losing the ability to communicate. Additionally, we find out the Lunarians have built schools all across the US to teach people the language of the Lunarians. We are retold the origin story of the Last Sun, and it just further cements the idea that the Last Sun was truly a benevolent person. He has always been treated harshly by both his parents and classmates, but despite all of that, he still wants to be someone who can save not just one or two people, but everyone. There's another thing that I want to touch on in this video very briefly that is pretty big. Some of these images are direct references to real life photos of Nixon. So this basically outright confirms that Nixon is indeed the last son. But then how are there two Nixons? And just one other thing I want to point out is the car wreck. The person that passes away here says something that is pretty odd.
To pull him out, but the man was impaled between the seat and the wheel. The man looked the boy in the eye and said, "You won, little bastard."
The way he said it almost insinuates he knew who the last son was on a personal level. There's a theory that this man is actually James Dean. Of course, this is just a theory, and remember, this is an alternate timeline where James is just a pedestrian, if this is even James Dean. In my own headcanon, I think this is James, and there's a quote by Nixon that goes like this: "You can hate your enemies, but if you do, they win." During this accident, the last son, who we now know is Nixon, was trying his best to rescue this man, so much to the point that he actually fainted. In case you don't know, Nixon was always looked at as a very stubborn man that always wanted to win. So to me, what this looks like is Nixon's will to win and have things done his way was so strong that it's consistent through all timelines and universes. Since he was running against Dean in one timeline, if he didn't try and save him in this timeline, it would be deemed as defeat in the mind of Nixon. But again, that's just my own headcanon and was kind of probably very confusing. And sorry for breaking immersion, but is this potentially a JoJo reference?
Dirty deeds done dirt cheap. Oh my God!
We find the D-Day night has resurfaced for the first time since his appearance during World War II. Additionally, we know that the year of this video is around that 1975 area. We know this because in the Sea of the Last Sun video, we learned that the last son was transformed into the king after the Vietnam War. The knight is found on top of the Chrysler building along with a dark speck in the background, and upon zooming in, it is quite clearly a person. We soon learn that this person is actually Alice Avenue, who is the woman narrating the earlier broadcast, informing us on what the Crescent King has done. The final screen shows us two lines of text, one saying "no one is gone forever" and the other "do not share their secrets." The first line of text could be alluding to one of two things, one being the D-Day night not having shown up for a very long time, and the other being that Alice will somehow be making a return. The text about secrets I'm 99% sure is referring to Alice and this broadcast. Alice got caught informing people about what has happened and that the king must be reversed in order to get language back. Furthermore, she says if the king can't be reversed, she hopes that the knight can save them, which is quite ironic since this incident would lead to her demise by the hands of the D-Day knight. And before we move on to the next video, in case any of you guys are wondering why the knight took out Alice, I believe it's for this reason right here by GoodBoa21 on Reddit. D-Day Nightfall, it's implied that the knight is actually Frank Sinatra in this world. We can see that he shares the same blue eyes as the last sun once he awakens his powers. Additionally, this cover is alluding to a connection between the last sun and the night. Nights obviously referring to the D-Day nights, and then day referring to sun, and sun sounding like the last sun. We cut to a clip of the Lunarians conducting electrical brain surgery on human civilians. At this point, we find that the knight has also been affected by the language destruction and has a tough time communicating to us in English. In a shocking turn of events, we find out that Alice is supposedly alive and that the knight simply lost his temper. The knight says that Alice is now in his world, where her soul now resides inside a statue, similar to how freedom functioned in MM. In case you guys don't remember, let's take a look at freedom as well as an entity called a canyon crown from MM. If all this is still fresh in your head, feel free to skip to the timestamp on screen to move on. Back in MM, there was a monument called the Statue of Freedom, and inside the statue reside both Thomas Crawford and his daughter Nina. Thomas discovered a magical material called Giza glass, where if cut by the glass, you'll be totally fine and whatever you just cut off will still be able to move. And this was how the Crawfords were able to live inside the Freedom Statue. Moving on, I want to touch on canyon crowns, which are also related to Giza glass. If you are decapitated by the glass, you'll become a giant swelling floating head called a canyon crown. And of course, you'll still be alive, but you are unable to speak, you can only mouth words. We cut to a memorial for Alice, and at first it doesn't seem too strange until the head begins floating off of the statue. And something I want to mention real quick is that Alice is the Nixonverse version of Lois Lane. Lois and Lane both starting with the letter L, Alice and Avenue both starting with A, and then of course both Lane and Avenue being street designations. We can now see that the knight has taken the head of Alice in order to wear it over his own head, and he keeps it on for an entire day. What we are presented with next is very strange. So we are quite literally told that this thing is a monster. After the D-Day Knight took off the head of Alice, his shape-shifting powers have just completely gone awry, and he has turned into this deformity. The final quote that we are left with is, "Grief can make you a monster." This quote is open for interpretation, of course. One theory that I quite like is that the knight actually did end up murdering Alice when he threw her off the Chrysler building, and he has since been combating the grief and denial of this. To further cement this idea, if we look at the actual song lyrics of the track Night and Day by Frank Sinatra, it's about being figuratively tormented by a woman. Of course, I don't think the knight actually loved Alice, but regardless, it communicates the idea that the knight was in emotional turmoil. In a way, the Sinatra cover from earlier could have also been teasing the downfall of the knight, similar to The Last Sun. day referring to the last sun and being blacked out to signify that he has fallen, while the night is still a bright orangish color yet to have been corrupted. If we take a look back at where the knight was communicating with us, we can see that he was still quite enraged with himself, and each statement was ended with either one or multiple exclamation marks. And I think this is masterfully hidden behind the facade of the destroyed English language, so one could chalk all this up to just not being able to communicate properly, when in fact the knight is actually suffering inside and absolutely enraged with himself. As for the statue, it actually exists in the real world as Lois Lane, and perhaps the knight saw her in this other world and thought to himself that since statues like Freedom exist, that means Alice is also alive, not knowing that since it's a different world, it would make the statue a different Alice. But I think it's safe to conclude that the knight currently is very unstable and potentially poses a massive threat to any and all that lie in his way. And as of right now, we don't know of his intentions.
I'm recording now. Tell me everything.
I remember when I left the Horned Serpent. I landed on your moon first. And you knew better than to set foot on your world. And I wondered whether you all would accept me or not. To find the answer, I have run an experiment. I produced 3 beings out of myself. The sun, the night, and the queen. All 3 of them are extensions of me. They are meant to test your world, and they will go mad, each in their own way. Your world is not kind to them. Your world will never be kind. Their sacrifice will make me realize that I can never risk stepping foot on Earth either. The closest I will ever be to your world is right here on the moon. One more thing. It is inevitable that the sun will become the king of the lunarians. Once his transformation is complete, I must destroy him. For he will be one of the most dangerous leaders in the universe. The king must perish. I am sorry, Mr. Floyd. No human was ever meant to hear what I have said.
Nixon as God drops some massive lore bombs and basically connects everything for us. We open up with an autopsy of Ed Dwight, and instantly we know that this video takes place before or during the Vietnam War, specifically on one of the previous moon expeditions. Reason being, the text is perfectly legible English that has not been affected by the Crescent King just yet. We find out that the cause of death for Ed was a self-inflicted head wound from a ray gun, and we are told that the motive for this may be revealed in the attached piece of audio that was recorded by Ed. First, I want to make it clear though that Nixon is not actually God, but more so a godlike figure, or at least that's what I believe, as a true God would be the one responsible for creating life, and in the message Nixon makes it clear that he came from the Horned Serpent into this already created world. Nixon, being aware of his immense power and capability, feared that human society would ostracize him, so as a test he created 3 beings, the sun, the night, and the queen, and had them all interact with Earth. Nixon continues and tells us all 3 of them were destined to go mad in an attempt to see if they will still be accepted by the world, and the results showed that Earth was not capable of being kind and never will be. Now Nixon must stop the Crescent King, as he has the ability to become one of the most dangerous leaders to ever exist in the universe. All of this new information was just too much for Ed to handle. Nixon even says that no human was ever meant to learn about Nixon's plans or origin. Following the Nixon audio, we can see two bodies which we can assume to be Ed Dwight, and that ends the Nixon is God video. Now, while we did get a lot of answers in this video, we are also left with a lot of questions. But before I talk about those, I have another fun trivia fact. If you recall, in the original MM series, James Dean was looked at as a devil, and now in the Nixonverse, Nixon is God. But it seems that each person is acting as the opposite of their role. For example, Dean, despite being labeled as the devil, did such things as providing free hearing aids to all of America after the ADA attack, while Nixon as God has sent out 3 beings that are capable of ending Earth and potentially harm the universe, which I deem as pretty reckless. Again, Nixon is only godlike and not actually God. I believe that Mr. Manticore intentionally posed Nixon in a position similar to Dr. Manhattan for this reason, to say that he is only a god-like being, not actually God. We begin the video with 3 audio clips from Ed Dwight, 2 of which sound stern and the final being angry. But what exactly does this mean? Before we can learn more about Ed Dwight, we cut to a chessboard with the piece known as the Knight, obviously signifying the D-Day night.
I wanted to welcome them. I wanted to welcome all humans to our kingdom. We all could have been great together. We could have all been peaceful. But my invitation was met with pain. A bright, burning pain. I should have known. Their entire world is built on inequality. Even their peace equation is an inequality. Knight, you are now blind, deaf, and mute. You cannot taste or touch. As long as you stay on Earth, none of your senses will return. But you can get everything back. Our prophecy guarantees this. Join our kingdom and become a prince. Run alongside me. Rule with our king.
Okay, so let's break down what we just saw. So the Queen approaches the Knight with a similar proposition that was offered to the Last Son. We learned that after the Knight's transformation into a monster, that he can no longer see, hear, speak, taste, or even touch. So that means the Queen is communicating telepathically. The Queen tells the Knight that if he were to choose to side with the Lunarians, the prophecy would be able to restore all of the Knight's senses. We then see the Knight reposition himself on the board and take a checkmate position before telepathically saying, "There is no prophecy, there is only me. Alcatraz checkmate." The Knight has just solo squatted the entire Lunarian fleets, and after about 9 months, all human languages have also been restored. Here we see the Crescent King with the following messages. Grief made him a monster. He will not stop crying. He does not want to live. The horned serpent lives. Now, at first I, along with many others, were somewhat confused, mainly due to the text, grief made him a monster. This quote would lead some to believe that somehow the knight has turned into the Crescent King after eliminating the Lunarians, and I believe that Alex intentionally did this to sort of mess with our heads. Personally, I'm on the side of the majority that think that this is the exact same Crescent King that evolved from the Last Sun. After the Lunarians are eliminated, there is no longer anyone to keep the king on a leash, so to speak. The final message is the horned serpent lives, which leads me to assume that over time the king would evolve once more into the horned serpent from the main MM series. And if we recall, the serpent is what destroyed that universe. As we see the king standing upright, that could be the signal that his new evolution is beginning.
There will be no physical altercation. I will not bring about an end like that of my own world. The only way to destroy the Crescent King is to render him as fiction. The same way through mythology and urban legends to powerful gods and monsters, he will have no authority once no one believes he is real. I must also render myself as fiction. I have involved myself too deeply. Like your world, I will be a necessary sacrifice. No one will feel pain. No one will be killed. This world will be fictionalized.
Ed Dwight did not blast himself. It was a cover story. It was Nixon who killed Ed Dwight. Nixon was no god. He was not even a man. Nixon was only one of many survivors. He did what we all secretly wish to do, but cannot. Nixon used his power to erase history. Nixon erased the past. Ed Dwight was twice the god that Nixon could ever be. He was bold. He was kind. He was good. In our world, Ed Dwight never went to the moon. Instead, he creates monuments. In our world, Ed Dwight preserves the past.
Nixon informs us that he does not want this world to end despite him not being welcomed, and now in order to prevent the king from reenacting the same destruction in Nixon's world, he is going to fictionalize this world. So when I first watched this video, I was really lost, but before I begin letting my thoughts spill out and attempt to piece everything together, let's first go over exactly what we saw. So Nixon successfully fictionalized the Nixonverse world/timeline, and on this comic cover we can see that the art was created by none other than Ed Dwight. We then learned that Ed Dwight did not harm himself, but instead Nixon was the one to take him out, thus meaning the self-inflicted head wound was an attempt at a cover-up. The narrator then says that Nixon was no god, not even a man, and that he was only one of many survivors, which could be a nod at the corner folk in the original MM timeline, and as a result result of fictionalizing this world, Nixon has erased the past. The narrator also informs us that in this world, our world, Ed creates monuments and never went to the moon, which if you don't know is actually true. Ed Dwight was the first African American to enter the Air Force training program where NASA selected astronauts from, but Ed was never selected, so instead Ed became a sculptor. And that concludes the entirety of the Nixonverse. So now let's break down what the Ed Dwight paradox video even means, because this is immensely confusing on the surface. First, I want to provide some supplemental info. Most of you know what a paradox is, but just in case, I'll restate the definition. It's an idea/statement where, despite giving adequate and sound examples and reasoning, you still end up at a contradictory conclusion. We also know that Alex has derived inspiration from DC for various aspects and characters in this story. The title, The Ed Dwight Paradox, is clearly paying homage to the comic The Flashpoint Paradox. Nixon informed us that he was only a figment that broke off from the Horned Serpent, which introduced us to this new universe/timeline called the Nixonverse. In the Flashpoint Paradox story, the Flash would go back in time to save his mother, which would also result in the creation of a new timeline. If you are familiar with that story, you will know this action drives that new world to destruction, and in order to fix it, Barry had to go back in time yet again and prevent his past self from saving his mother. Upon doing this though, he would create a new DC reality entirely, which merged multiple realities together. In this Nixonverse story, a similar thing happens. Nixon fictionalized his world in order to prevent it from being destroyed by the Crescent King, which essentially merged the main MM timeline, the Nixonverse timeline, and our real world timeline together. And in our world, both Mr. Manticore and Ed Dwight are the creators of this new mega reality. In DC Comics, there is a being that is supposed to be the absolute most powerful since they are the creator. In DC, that almighty creator is called the Presence. So in this story, Mr. Manticore would be our equivalent to the Presence. And I don't want to stray too far from the Nixonverse, but as you all likely know, Alex has recently uploaded a new video titled The Trinity Desk. And in that video, we have this image of 7 people. Now, this could very well be a massive stretch, but I think this might be a reference to the Circle of Eternity, which was created by the Presence. So is Mr. Manticore somehow responsible for creating this Council of 7? If the answer is yes, then that would confirm that this is season 4 of MM, and it might mean that the Trinity Desk will be a story that this time takes place in our world, the world where Mr. Manticore is the creator. This is all just crazy headcanon, and I don't think I've seen anyone else propose something like this, so I could very well be wrong. Let me know what you think in the comments. Now that I'm done with my rant, back to the Ed Dwight paradox. A lot of this is going to be my own headcanon yet again, so just keep that in mind. The narrator says that Ed Dwight was twice the god that Nixon could ever be. If my previous claims about Nixon and Ed Dwight being creators is true, then the narrator meant this in a more literal sense, as Ed creates monuments to preserve them. I might be searching for something that isn't even there, but I feel the word preserve is odd here. Preserve would mean to maintain and keep intact. Could this mean that somehow Ed Dwight is still keeping that universe alive somehow, since he is the last link still preserving that world after it has been erased? Right before the video goes black, we get a sort of post-credit scene. This post from Reddit brightens the image and breaks down just what we're looking at. We can see a man that is supposed to be James Dean painting something. According to OP, the painting is The Road to Happiness, which oddly resembles Wonderland, which if you remember is where George Washington went after chopping a special tree. Additionally, we know that in the original MM universe, the tree spat out other George Washingtons, which could explain the multiple Ed Dwights in this picture. But this image drives me absolutely insane. I have no idea if this is just meant to be nothing or is actually key to the lore. What does James Dean have to do with the Nixonverse? Because up to this point, we really haven't seen him at all. Is James Dean somehow another creator of our world similar to Ed Dwight and Mr. Manticore? Is Ed Dwight simply a figment of James Dean's imagination? I'm completely lost on this image. I can't tell if Alex is just trolling us again by making us think too deeply about nothing, or if there's actually key lore hidden in here. And that's going to end my exploration into the Nixonverse. Amazing job by Mr. Manticore, just raising the bar on each upload on Analog Horror. And thank you guys so much if you made it through this entire video. I really appreciate your time. If you guys did enjoy it, it would be amazing if you could drop a like. And again, if we can hit 1K likes on this within 2 to 3 days, I'll get the House in the Ocean video out within the week. And if you're interested in the Trinity Desk series by Alex, definitely subscribe, as I will be providing another analysis video on that series once it's completed. With all that being said, again, thank you very much, and I'll talk to you all again very soon.